and is taken then from chapter 2 of the book of Ecclesiastes. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with myrrh. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also is vanity. I said to laughter, madness, and of myrrh, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, until I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees and grove. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered for myself silver and gold and special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, and my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my reward from all my labor, that I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and a grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. That I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom exceeds folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, and the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for the wind. That I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I have toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despised all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what is man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart gives no rest. This also is vanity. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Well, over the last number of months, it has been a time, I'm sure, where many have questioned some of the great things in life. And I'm not speaking now, what's the price of beer? I'm actually speaking about the big things of life, such as being the turnaround, the turmoil, the uncertainty, even the threat of death, the things that we took for granted. Perhaps there's been that question, or those questions. What is life? Why are we here? What are we supposed to do in the life that we are to live? And the reason being, you see, is that because we have been confronted with the brevity of life, the fact now that what we live for has been taken away, we began to see the futility. We've also known at this time people have great grief. Others have known of loss of jobs. Others have come to have perhaps ill health. We have been separated from our friends. And what's happened is that perhaps we've had many questions that people have asked, well, ever since they could remember. But they're the big questions of life. And this very moment, I just want to ask you to consider just this chapter, which is found in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Actually, the book of Ecclesiastes is a book which is filled with questions. And if you looked very carefully, you could find 7, perhaps even 8 questions within this very chapter, dealing with the very fact, what is life all about? What are we to do with a life that's been given to us? Now, as I mentioned, this is not a new question. But I tell you what happens is this. The very fact that we have these things that we're asking shows us that we're lost. But it's not the very fact that we've got questions to ask that shows us that we're lost. It's the answers that really clinch it, that we as human beings are utterly lost. And there have been in this world, as there is today, think of it, science, with all its understanding, with all its knowledge, do you know what it's given us? More questions. Do you know what you find when you study the very things of philosophy? Do you know that they've come to the conclusion that the wisest you can ever be is that you come to know nothing? That's the end of philosophy. You can turn to the religions of the world, and what that's trying to answer some of the great perplexities of life. And when you begin to search and see what they give, they're in utter darkness. But now we find here, in this book before us, there is a man. He is known even today as the wisest person who ever lived apart from the Lord Jesus Christ. And as we saw, if you wanted to turn to it, in chapter 1, he comes and he begins to seek. In verse 13, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. And what now in this chapter we have are the end of his searching, or the experiment. What he has now written to us in this book is his PhD of what life is like under the sun without the knowledge of God. And the more he sought for answers, you find in this chapter, the more questions is what he had. Only thing I want to tell you before we begin, because I don't want to depress you, I know that people make fun of the little chorus, Christ is the answer to my every need. Someone can say that's too simplistic, but it's the truth. But it's the truth. Without Jesus Christ, you've only got questions. You've only got questions, and you don't have the answers to life. But I would want you to come now to this chapter, because this is perhaps the greatest experiment that's ever been taken, and with the greatest acquiring and the greatest opportunity to get something out of life, in something to live under the sun. And what he does, you see, is very simple. Now we've seen the very failure and the futility of secularism. We've seen the failure of rationalism. But now you see, you're going to see the very emptiness too of hedonism and pleasure. You find it here in verse 1. He says, my heart, come now, I will test you with myrrh and therefore enjoy pleasure. And I suppose that is then one of the answers that we give in life. Because when we're living, we think to ourselves, well, I tell you what I need to do. I need to get as much out of it as I can, to find as many experiences and pleasures that one can live for. And yet, you see, we're going to find here, do you know what that leads to? More questions. There it is in verse 2. He wanted to have that laughter, madness, and of myrrh. What does it accomplish? And that's the question. What does it accomplish? He wants to set his heart, as he tells us, on the things now of laughter. We're living in a day where we are, which has given itself over to pleasure. We're living in a generation that believes that this is now the key to life. And the reality is, here's a man who made that his search. And what is the end of all laughter? The comedy circuit that people are tuned into. The comedians which pass our way. I mean, you know and I know. The fact is that some of them, many of them, are some of the most cynical characters and saddest of people. The clown with a smile on his face. I mean, the joker in the pack, the one who makes everybody laugh, is the one who's got tears inside. And I could give you so many statistics of the reality of that. And yet, here's something to underline. The question, what does it accomplish? What does it really do? And then he gives us a list of how he searched for this pleasure. Well, how up to date is this? In verse 3, he says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom. And that's number one on people's agenda. Well, what I need to do is a little drink will help us then get through the week and through life. Like if drink was ever the answer. What does that really accomplish? And yet people have nowhere else to turn. Let me give you a statistic. In the time of lockdown, the sale on alcohol went up 33% in this land. The pubs were closed. You say, what happened? People had nowhere else to turn. As one person said to me, they said, well, what else was I to do? I could only then, bring out the cans. But look, was that really the real key? Was that the real solution? The reality is this. What does it accomplish? I tell you what it accomplishes. It accomplishes poverty. It accomplishes broken homes. It accomplishes breakdown in marriages. It accomplishes a loss of life. That's what it accomplishes on so many factors. As I remember a number of years ago, I remember having to bury a person in this town who knew what it was, that the bottle was her salvation. It was also her destruction. It's something that she needed, something that she loathed. And what that brings to life. He says, look, that's what I've done. And that may be you. You've tried then, knowing in the things of the emptiness of life, just then to rid your thoughts, to escape in some way. Well, here's a man who did it. And he said, I put my heart. But it only brought more questions. What does it accomplish? And then look what he does. He then goes into this great work with all the laughter and all the folity. Then in verse 4, I made great works. I built myself houses. I planted for myself vineyards. Here it is. Look, I made gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of trees. And look what he did with water, growing trees, with growth. Now we're looking, aren't we, to do something which is purposeful and meaning in life. There's always a reaction. Look, when I've taken away now from the very pleasures of life, we want to make something which is more substantial. And he begins to plant, and he begins to build. Oh, you couldn't do better today. Do you know what your solution in life is? No, you must know it. We've had it for the last few years. Plant a tree. Yeah, if I planted a tree, that's definitely going to give me, the ethical feeling better that I'm doing something for a planet. Here's a man, he built orchards and gardens and reservoirs and water holes and grew trees. Oh no, that must have been a fine sight. Just want you to note how he tried then to answer this question. In all that he was to do, I made my works great, in verse 4. And then look at verse 7. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions. And the third thing that we do it, don't we? We believe that the acquiring of possessions somehow will fill that void. And he tells us, look, he had the lot. If you want to know what Naboth is like, well, it was a touch of Solomon's palace in it. Here it is in verse 8. I gathered for myself silver and gold, special treasures, or the antiques, the unusual things from antiquity. Oh, if I could only have one of those and put it in my house, that's going to actually fill my heart. It does not fill one's heart whatsoever. And yet, that's what we do. And look, one's not against, as I will show you, the finer things of life. I'd rather look at things which are beautiful and things which are ugly. It's good to see things which are pleasant and things which are not. But you may even have those things as I'm speaking to you now. You look around your house and you've got the fine touches. And you know what those fine touches do? They just make you crave for more. What possessions do in one's life. I'll tell you a story as mad as this one would be. I had a phone call a few months ago during the time of COVID. It was from a consultant in the hospital that I needed to go down and see someone because they were dying. And they asked for me. Well, if you were to ask for a minister when you were dying, what would you want? Do you know what I did? I picked up my Bible. I went down to that hospital just to go into the ward because now a person was dying. And what I was to do was to give them those words which will carry them into eternity, to give them that prayer which will be able to help them and have strength to point them to the way of Christ. Do you know when I got there? Do you know what he wanted? He wanted me to go shopping. I actually had to go shopping to buy the last few items which he needed in life. Madness! What could that possibly do? Look what happens here. It only leads to more questions. In verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. And he had everything. He did his work. That was his reward. I looked at all my works, verse 11, the labor of my hands in which I toiled. Listen to the word. And indeed, it was all vanity and a grasping for the wind. And that's when you begin to realize you have lived for the pleasures. You've planted and made things to last. You have the possessions all around you. And perhaps you've had as much as any has had in life. And now as I look, it is like grasping for the wind. And it is nothing and weightlessness. Look, it leads to more questions. The more that you have, is the more that you realize how empty it all is. I'll give you the questions. Here they are in verse 12. He began to consider, and here's the question for you. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he's already done. And what Solomon is saying, well, I've had more than anyone else. He was the richest man of his day. He says he excelled more, he tells us that, than any in Jerusalem before, in verse 9. He had servants, vineyards, building projects on an extensive scale. There was nothing that he was not able to have. And then he begins to think, who can have more than me? Who can do more than me? Ask that question yourself. Do you actually believe for a moment that there's only one more thing that you need? That you only need one other project? One other accusation to bring into your life? No. He says, I looked at it. And that was another question. No one could do more. It was just vanity. That's what he tells us. And then he begins to tell us. Look now again in verse 15. He's showing us that although he was wise, what was the point really in it all? Here's another question to have. Because he was just like those who are foolish, although it is better to be educated than uneducated. But the same event happens to them all. Verse 14. But look at verse 15. This is another question. And why was I more wise? And then I said into my heart, this is also vanity. That's the next question it brings up. As Solomon began to look around him, he realizes now he was wise and that he had been given gifts in life. But what was the point of that? Why me? Have you ever asked that yourself? Do you know that you actually are one of the richest people who has ever lived in this world? No, really, when you take the history of the world and you take up how it's been for millennium after millennium of people living from day to day and in poverty, the vast majority, people who are uneducated, who don't know what you know, who couldn't read or write, and the vast majority in the world today, you're living in your homes, you have all this technology, you have the internet at your fingertips, you have all the food that you have had all the learning that you need, you have got health in your body. What have you done with it? What's it all about? Why should I have this and lived such a futile life? What was the point of me having all this? The wisdom that I've known, it only brings other questions. That brings us to another question, you see, which then he has. Look, I just need you to realize this. Since all that now is will be forgotten, so even the wisdom I've had and all that I've done, for all that now is will be forgotten. All I planted, all the trees, all my knowledge, all my pleasure, forgotten. And how does the wise man die? Verse 16. Do you know the answer to that? As the fool. as the fool. It's the questions of life and pleasures in every area and in every form. Look at the list. Will not fill the human heart. But I need you to do something. I need you now, you see, to look at what takes place, because it's all vanity, grasping for the wind. And verse 18, the result of this in a person's life, how true this is. I hated all the labor in which I toiled under the sun. Because it is labor. Do you know, trying to enjoy yourself can be hard work. Trying to live, to have pleasure, can kill you. And what he came to at the end, I want you to notice these words. I hated all the labor. You know, there's a philosophy in life, and it's telling our children this. The teachers tell them, I want you to tune in to what you're learning. I want you to be turned on in life. You know the next step, don't you? Drop out. That is the history. That's the experience of those who have given themselves to the living of this world. Now I can give you many examples. I'm just going to give you one, the ones you know. Alexander the Great. You can read actually an account of his life. But actually he was a man who had great talents. He was also a man who was given up to great hedonism. He knew what it was to fight, and he knew what it was to enjoy. Those are the two aspects in his life. But you know the story which was given, and it was simply this, that there came a moment that when he had conquered all of the known world, that he was found crying in his tent. And in his tent, he was crying because there were no other worlds for him to conquer. He had given it all. And what had taken place? That's the end of his life. He hated all the labor in which he had toiled. Verse 19, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. I'll give you another example. There was a famous story of a man called Voltaire. He was a leading leader in France in the Revolution. He was a man of culture, of standing, of teaching, of learning in society, with money and influence. He had it all. Do you know what he said at the end of his life? Here it is. I wish I'd never been born. He had it all. Listen to these words. It's here, verse 20. Therefore I turned my heart and despised all the labor in which he had toiled under the sun. I despised it. I hated. He came to this place where all that he had known was toil and labor. I'll give you another. I could go here all day of the reality of the knowledge. There was a man, let me just see if I've got it here in my papers. I've underlined it. He was an excellent businessman. His name was Jay Gould, and he became a multi-millionaire. At the age of 21, he had £5,000 to invest, and he invested it well in the railroad. And then what happened, he ended up owning a number of railroads. Then he ended up owning many companies. Then in America, he cornered the gold market until in the end, there was industries after industries. But when he came to die, do you know the last words that he said? I'm the most miserable man who's ever lived. Now look at that. Alexander the Great crying in his tent. Voltaire wishing never been born. Mr. Gould as miserable as sin. Do you know why? Because once you've lived for life, you all end up as Victor Meldrum. We all end up as grumpy as can be. I hate this. Everything's a burden. A toil for everything. And I despised of all the labor in which I had toiled. And so it is that that is the experience. Now I hope that you're still with me at this moment, because this is vanity, everything that he came to know. And there it is in verse then, let's have a look. Verse 23, just picking up. For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome, and even in the night his heart takes no rest. All is vanity. You can acquire money for a bed, but it won't give you sleep. You can acquire money for your house, but it won't give you a mansion in glory. You can acquire all the food for your belly, but it won't fill your soul. Now listen, please, very carefully. Hold on, because we do have here just a glimmer of light. And I need you just to hear this, because there it is in verse 24. As Solomon now has lived his life, which is horizontally for those things under the sun. He knew God. He had an experience of God in the past. You may be like that this morning. You are someone who knew God when you were younger. But the pleasures, the possessions, the things of life, you lived your life without God, like an atheist. You had no time for him. And now, you know what you've become? It's no different. You're unhappy, filled with sorrow, knows of toil, hate the things you have, and even despise the life you've got. Please listen to this. There's a glimmer of light. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This is also, I saw, was from the hand of God. Verse 25. Now, listen carefully. Before you add up what I'm trying to say and make 2 and 2 5. Because you may think at the end of this chapter, knowing that you've lived for all that, I know what you're thinking. I need to get to the monastery. I need to become a nun. I need to drop out of life. I need now to take my way from the things of this world. No, listen carefully again. Because there is now, you see, an answer. And believe it or not, for the first time, we've got the name of God which is mentioned. And look, life is to be enjoyed. No, you don't realize. God made these things which are good. God gave work to the children of men. God has given meaning and purpose. But you can never know it and understand it unless God comes into your life. You see, here's the answer. And this gleam of light, which now dawns upon him in verse 4, that his soul should enjoy the good in his labor. This I also saw. There is a life to be enjoyed. We're not Stoics. We're definitely not that. We are people who know that God has given us the pleasures that we may just enjoy, but we don't. But I saw. This was from the hand of God. I'm going to give you just 2 other examples. There's a famous writer, I would say perhaps the greatest literary writer, his choice obviously, but his name was obviously Dostoevsky. And he writes from his experience of life. He was a man who was obviously given to mood swings, but the actual life that he lived is very interesting, which comes into his books. And that's why they are so true. There's such a depth to them, because he must have been drawing from Well, the experiences that he learned and what he went through. And one of the things is this: he did come to see that there were things in this life where he saw just great injustice, where he saw people being killed and murdered, the senselessness of life. Well, what happens in his little life was that he became a kind of political prisoner, ended up in a labor camp in Siberia, and then ended up on death row. Actually, he was sentenced to be executed. And this is how he describes, and the only way you can understand his little books, is that he was actually there standing before the firing squad. That's how close it came to actually being executed. And I don't know if they took the actual, whatever it was they put on their eyes, either they put it on or took it off, just before perhaps they put it on. He says for that moment before he was to die, he saw everything. He could hear the birds singing. He could see the sunset. He could see the green in the trees. And all of a sudden it becomes flooding into him. Now, I've known people like that. No, listen very carefully. There have been those who have lived life, moaned and groaned all their life. And all of a sudden they've had an illness, they've overcome it, and they realize it. Every day is a gift. I was only listening to the radio the other day. The man was certainly not a Christian, but that he began to enjoy the things that he had missed out on in life. Things around him, the experiences. Do you realize that these things are to be enjoyed? I saw it. Do you know what he saw? It was a gift from God. There it is in verse 25. You've got to come to this point. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment more than I? These are the questions. You can't find it in yourself. You will never find life, the meaning, the purpose, the answers in your life. It's not found within you. I'll just give you one more little quote to bring to you. There was a man called C.H. Leupold. He was a famous scholar. He said, true enjoyment is possible, but does not lie in man's power to bestow it to himself. No, here's the big thing. It is a gift from God. You can strive as much as you like, and you will lose it all. But in verse 26, the gleam of light at the end of it all, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to man. Here's the news you've been waiting for all morning. Here's the name of our great Savior. True life is given to us from God. You can enjoy it. It's not found in ourselves. You have to receive it from the hand of God. And the wonderful news I have for you is this, is that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And there's a God which has given to you and me this day. There is one he gave from heaven itself. There is one who came into this world. And there is life which is found. It is a gift from God. It says in John's Gospel, in him was life, and life was the light of men. There's a gift for you. Came from heaven. Life, real life. I'll give you another verse. The great I am sayings of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am the bread which has come down from heaven. He who comes to me will never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. Notice that. There's life, satisfaction, fulfillment. I'll give you another verse. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who comes to me shall never walk in darkness. But listen, shall have the light of life, of life. You'll not walk in the perplexity, the darkness, the futility, the meaninglessness of the existence in this world. You'll have the answers to life. The Lord Jesus Christ, listen, the gift from God, it was given from God. Here it is. And God gives wisdom and knowledge and the joy to a man. And he gave his only Son, the Word of God incarnate, the wisdom from on high, truth unchanged and changing, the light of our dark sky. He gives his Son. Knowledge is found in him. Wisdom is what he was personified. Joy was overflowing. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and they may have it more abundantly. Now look, this is what Solomon came to find. He had a question. He tried it in everything under the sun. And it only brought him, you saw the words, I hated, I was sorrowful, I was despised. I despised the life that I even had, but I saw that there was a gift given from God. If you want to know where life is found, the answer is found in the great grace and giving of his Son, Jesus Christ. And when you come to him, you have to receive him. Look, the very life itself, if I could put it like this, he has wrapped it up, the gift he gave, in flesh and blood, in bone and sinew. And he walked among us, and he became a man, and we knew what it was to have everlasting life, eternal. And what Jesus Christ came to bring us, do you know what he did? In his very being and living and doing and teaching, but most of all, listen, in his dying at Calvary and in his blood in which he spilled, there was this. He has given us a freedom from sin, forgiveness from our aimless and useless life, redeemed us from the futility of the grave. But look, he has come and he has washed our conscience clean so that you this afternoon can enjoy your Sunday dinner and you can gobble it up with a clean conscience, with a freedom of heart, with praise to God, with thankfulness. You can take every little piece of, don't want to offend you, but it's true, meat, and you can actually enjoy it. And you can even indulge a bit in your desserts. And you know what you can do? You can look around your house and you can look at your expensive car on the drive and you can say, thank you, God, for every bit of pleasure that you've given me, that I don't have to go and dig the coal to light the fire, but I know now of these very precious things that you've put in my hands, which would be to the praise and the glory of your name. Do you get it? That's it. I need to tell you about that. For you to know life this day, you've got to receive the gift which God has given. Wisdom, knowledge, and joy. It's found in the person of Jesus Christ. Look, please, I plead with you. If you're desperate, if you know what it is in your experience, please, I plead with you once again. Please. Because look at the very last verse. This is good in his sight. That's good. This is good. It's not a bad thing. Going to the monastery will take you to a lost eternity. It'll kill you with little enjoyment. But look, but to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. Listen very carefully. This also is vanity and a grasping for the wind. You may not think that life is much. You may have the fact that whatever you do is of little significance. You're wrong. Because there's a God who is taking note of every word, and of every action, of every deed, and of the work which he's given you to do that will be of meaning and purpose. But if you don't come and take of that gift, this becomes, you see, that which is futile and which is bad. And look, there's a God who is going to call us to account. And there's a God who deals with us. Even now, you may think that it's all left to just chance. It's not. But if you don't take of his hand, do you know what your life is? Here it is. It is all vanity. Listen to this. What is it? After the wind.